In my world there is music and good vibes and laughter and lovers, adventure and friendship. We know who we are.
Hello and welcome everybody to Be the Wellness Podcast. Adam and Vanessa Lambert podcasting.
Yes, we are.
At night.
At night. The sun, well, that's not very hard these days, given the sun goes down at like 4 p.m.
Jeez.
Damn daylight savings time.
Why do we have to live in the Arctic?
Actually, I don't know. So wait, this time of year, would the daylight savings time make it go lighter even earlier, or would it be darker, or would it be lighter longer? I can't remember. We fell back.
Yes, we did fall back. But
So-
I think we were on daylight savings time and now we're not.
So
I think.
basically, if it's dark now at like 6, if we didn't move it back to 4, it would be even earlier that it'd be dark.
Totally. It'd be
Okay.
like 2 p.m.
Okay. Are you following my logic tree?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bottom line.
So the
It's
comment
dark
I made
outside.
earlier about it being dark because of daylight savings time, it doesn't have anything to do with the truth.
Right. Yeah, but it is in fact dark, which is, kind of cramping our style on the weather update. Although it is Santa Ana winds and Malibu's on fire.
Malibu is on fire.
Yeah. I mean, as not just Malibu, but Thousand Oaks and all of the little communities in and around it. But Malibu will get all of the press.
Yeah, absolutely. Because Lady Gaga, not Kris Jenner, but
Bruce Jenner.
Bruce Jenner,
No,
but
Bruce
it's
Jenner is
Caitlyn Jenner.
there you
Yeah,
go,
thank
yeah.
you, Caitlyn Jenner.
What about him?
She lost her house.
Caitlyn Jenner.
Yes, it burned down.
Yeah.
It officially burned down. Lady Gaga is evacuated. All the people are being run
Yeah.
out of their homes.
It is.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's an equally catastrophic fire burning in Paradise outside
Yes.
of our old little home diggings of Chico.
Yep.
Yeah, it's man, just
Here we
never
go
ends.
again.
Yep. Fire season in California.
How are you feeling not being a fireman right now?
Well, I mean, I'm stoked that we're going to Costa Rica tomorrow, and I'm not, you know what I mean, and I'm not just like sweating it out on the side of a hill somewhere.
Right.
But we went out to the beach earlier, and we could see that fire just cranking through Malibu, and it's headed for the ocean, and yeah, there's parts of me that are like, oh man,
Yeah.
that was like, I know what to do about that, because at the end of the day,
I'm helpful.
I'm a problem solver.
Yeah.
Like that's what I like to do. And I'm like, I actually know exactly what to do about that problem. And here I am,
Yeah.
So it's still a little bit weird. But,
I have a question for you. How do you solve the problem of knowing what to do about that, but not getting to do anything about it?
Well, I don't know. You just like swallow it, move on.
I can give you some problems to solve.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Those
No,
are
you
not the
certainly
problems you want to solve?
can. Well, I don't know.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, Malibu's on fire, and we are wishing everyone that they get out of their homes safely. And, it is one of the things about living in that area. They kind of know that this is going to happen used to be like every 10 plus years.
Yeah.
We're seeing it every year now. So that's the
Yeah.
scary part. And really, it's kind of becoming uninhabitable in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's a little scary.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Like the fire history map for the Santa Monica Mountains, which is like what all of that stuff is like every 7 years there's something pretty substantial,
Right.
And the last time, so the Jesucita fire in 2007 burned like just a little bit south of where it's burning right now. It was
I
kind of
remember
the
that.
same, kind of the same jam. So 11 years for that particular area, but if you just chase it up a little bit north, it just is what it is. It's part of
Yeah,
the deal.
it is part of the deal.
If you live there, and when we first moved to LA, like I'd been to fires in these mountains several times, but when you're coming from Northern California, you're like, I don't know, it's LA and it's all the same.
Right.
Then when we got here, we were looking at property up in and around Malibu, and we just looked at these various places. And I got back to work, I pulled up the fire history maps and went through and looked at it, and I was like, there's not a single spot on this map that doesn't have multiple layers where these fires have burned through in the last 100 years. It's like every single thing up there has been burned 20 times. You're
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, and we've considered moving up to Topanga Canyon, even Malibu, and it is actually, it weighs heavily on our decision making. It's kind of like,
Yeah, no, it's a real thing.
Yeah,
you know?
it is a real
and
thing.
Topanga is like an extra special one. You know, it's one way in, one way out. It's
Right.
a contiguous canyon from 101, which is like the valley, essentially, all the way to the ocean. And that's just, you know, wind is just like water. It looks for the low point. And it's no good.
Yeah, so we said we weren't going to talk about weather, but we, in fact, found a way to squeeze it in.
Yeah. So that's the weather report for
So
Southern
that is
California.
the fire weather out of California. We're really excited to get to our guests, but first we want to remind you that there's a couple spaces left for Montana still for the Epic Adventure Retreat that we'll be hosting there next September, which apparently September is a really beautiful time of year to be there. It's right when the leaves start to turn, the crowds die down. Apparently it is the happening time to hang out in Montana.
Yeah, totally. So it's that perfect spot, right? Just like you said, after the crowds die, but before the weather turns, but you get a little bit of color in the trees. It's like, it's going to be cool.
I think it's going to be really cool. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like almost every woman I know, their favorite season is fall.
It's because of the boots.
It's the clothes.
Boots and jackets.
It's the things. I don't know. I don't know what it is, but we love fall. We love pumpkin lattes. Pumpkin everything.
Yeah.
I don't know, but there is definitely like a thing for women about fall.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think there is. I might be inventing a thing right now, but I'm going to go with it.
Right.
But so I'm really excited because it is one of my favorite times of year. And I feel like wherever we end up, so here on the beach, it's really beautiful because we get kind of like a second summer, like Adam was saying, and we get it's still warm and the water is really nice still, but there aren't as many people. So it's really nice. But then if you travel, we were just in Las Vegas visiting Katie and Glenn, and it was beautiful. The desert.
Yeah, the
is
temperature's
just
amazing.
Perfect all day long. So I just think fall's a really special time of year.
Yeah, kind of no matter where you are.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the point I'm making. Thank you. Thanks for bringing that around for me. So if you want to spend a special time of year with us next year, we invite you to Montana.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on and get to our awesome guest because Adam and I really enjoyed this conversation and plan on having Allie back again because she's just really a plethora of knowledge and we really agree with her and just are in alignment with her point of view on all of this stuff that we talk about today. So Allie Miller is an RD, meaning registered dietitian. And the interesting thing about her is that she is... Her background is more in the naturopathic medicine line. So she's actually went to school, to a naturopathic school in order to get her degree. So it's a little bit different than the traditional route of schooling. And we'll actually talk about how it differs in the podcast. And I think this is really an important thing to sort of queue up for people because, you know, functional medicine and sort of this naturopathic background really looks at the person as a whole. So instead of, you know, trying to dissect out symptoms or, you know, sort of diagnose someone based on, you know, one sort of thing that's happening for them, the naturopath or the, you know, the more functional medicine point of view is to look at the person as a whole. Right. So this is what what I really appreciate about Allie is that she's just spot on with, you know, really pointing out that each individual is going to have their own sort of N=1 and that each individual is really going to dictate for themselves what the path of healing is going to be.
Right.
And it's just, you know, I think it's important that we're hearing this from so many voices in the wellness world right now. We're really hearing over and over and over again. There is no one size fits all solution. There are some cornerstones and some pillars that everyone can agree upon for the most part. But at the end of the day, we're just hearing time and time again that your unique paleo, primal, keto wellness code is going to be different.
Right.
And Allie is actually an author. She's recently written the Anti-Anxiety Diet book. And again, this is drawing on her experience working as an RD and really helping people to understand their own unique physiology and how to really tackle the mental component while really recognizing that the food and, you know, sort of the underlying inflammation story is probably a catalyst for all of the symptoms that you're going to be experiencing, right, including anxiety.
Yeah, totally. She really brings this stuff together in a way that that I haven't really heard, you know, I mean, so there's like, and just like a lot of things in this, you get a taste of this and a taste of this and a taste of this. but it takes somebody like her to kind of put it all together into something where you're like, oh,
Yes.
interesting. And so like I kind of put her in the realm of like Chris Kresser in that way. Like he's done that for me before too, explaining stuff where I'm like, oh, all right, now I connect, A to Z. And I think she does a great job of doing that. And we talk a ton of stuff, and we get kind of nerdy on the podcast, but it's worth listening.
But it's really worth listening. And, even if some of the stuff is over your head, the bottom line is, I think the most important thing is that each time you listen to a podcast like this, or you listen to someone who comes from this sort of naturopathic background, you're going to pick up a few nuggets of wisdom. And those pearls you're going to be able to take with you and sort of apply to your own story. But eventually you start to build an arsenal of knowledge around your own personal story. And I think that that's what's really cool about piping in and listening to these conversations, is that you really are, giving yourself an arsenal of tools to step into your, your next best, healthiest person.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the thing that's next for solving your problem.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
You got to keep digging.
Yeah, so we're really excited to have her on. We are already planning on having her back. So before she comes back, we're going to actually field out to the audience questions, anything that you might want to ask her. She's a wealth of information, and we know you guys are going to get a lot out of this podcast. So we're excited to welcome Allie to the podcast.
And we're live. Welcome to the podcast, Allie.
Thank you. I'm so pumped to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you here. And as I mentioned before we went live, I've been feverishly writing down questions, because the topics that we'll talk about today are things that we're really seeing a huge, prevalency in the wellness industry and health and fitness. And so there's a lot of great stuff that we're going to cover today. But first, let's get the audience up to date and just tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into functional medicine, and maybe just give them a little bit of your background story.
Sure. So I am a registered dietitian, but I went to a naturopathic college of medicine, Bastyr University. And at that time, they just had a campus outside of Seattle, Washington. So I went there. And in my process, I was actually considering becoming a naturopathic doctor. My boyfriend at the time, was doing organic farming. And I was also a vegan. And I actually went to the school because they had a vegetarian cafeteria. And I thought I was going to just change the whole world and, make the world a better place and all the things. And in my coursework, I did a couple different things that really redefined my relationship with food. As I got deeper into sustainability, a lot of my professors were questioning my tubs of earth balance compared to butter I could get churned down the road, right? It's like, right. Is this a whole food? Can you imagine it growing? No. Right. And so I started to really connect in that level. And also I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease in my last year at school, Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. And that's also kind of the same onset of when I started dealing with a lot of anxiety and panic. And I started totally revamping my diet into more of an omnivore approach, more of a paleo approach, removing all grains. And I started to then take things further into even a ketogenic diet over time. And I found a really grounding relationship with food. And so that's kind of my personal story. And then functionally, I practice what's called functional integrative medicine. And so instead of becoming a naturopath, I became an RD. So I kind of have a leg on both the conventional medical model and then the naturopathic model. And I treat each individual as a unique being that comes to me with their wonderful complexity. And I get to be the detective of their body.
Wow, that's a really good way to say that. That sounds like so much fun.
Yeah, right. It is. It's like, I spend 90 minutes in an initial consult, and I often say people leave clinic knowing more about themselves than they did prior to the consult, because we dig really, really deep. And that was really the premise of my second book, The Anti-Anxiety Diet, was whether I was dealing with someone coming in for digestive distress or PCOS and hormone imbalance or for metabolic disorders, I really found that if their stress axis was off, that they were just kind of playing whack-a-mole with symptoms. And I really determined that we had to rebalance this parasympathetic nervous system state to find harmony within the body and allow the body to heal.
Yeah, that That's incredible. So, and I want to dive super deep into that, but I just want to back it up for just a second because so then this is something that we hear about a lot in the paleosphere and really actually sort of everywhere in the people who are really trying to help folks nutritionally is that the registered dietitian path can sometimes be pretty mainstream and a little bit counter to what maybe you have known for yourself through, dealing with your autoimmune disorder. And so I'm curious how the RD training along with the naturopathic training, like where did you find some incongruencies there? Or is this kind of an overblown, rumor out there about RDs kind of getting a monolithic view of what goes on?
Oh, it's totally not an overblown, concept or misnomer. I think that it is true. I mean, the whole world of dietetics was born and funded by General Mills. So there's, I think, a lot of still corporate interest. And, I'm personally not a member of a lot of the professional organizations. I don't like to bash anyone, but my training was very unique that it was at the naturopathic college. So when I was learning, when we were learning about saturated fats, we were learning that saturated fats were the most heat stable because a saturated bond means less opportunities for oxidative damage. So, we would actually connect biochemistry, believe it or not, with structural functional health. And so I didn't learn a lot of the stuff that I hear people saying. And I will say, some of the information that I had to memorize and spit back out for my RD exam was interesting to say at least, where I just kind of was like short-term memory only, not locking this in. And it is what it is. And I'm grateful though that I went forward with the licensure because like I said, it allows me to kind of like just last week I was in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I lectured for the AADE, the American Association of Diabetic Educators. And I got to speak for an hour and a half to pharmacists and endocrinologists and nurses and dietitians about functional approaches to manage diabetes. And so the letters help. And I think that they're important and I don't want to disrespect them because there are a lot of intelligent, forward-thinking dietitians out there.
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
Well said.
So I really want to make this distinction because, although our audience is pretty sophisticated and generally pretty aware of the distinctions between the sort of general path and doing something more holistic like yourself, what, for the listener out there who's not really familiar, wouldn't know personally, what's the sort of situation that you might find yourself in where you might decide to seek out someone like yourself, someone more in the more functional medicine realm, rather than going to your general GP? Maybe you can just kind of lay out something or some of the symptoms, if you will, of what might present itself in a person's life that they go, I don't know, I feel like I need a second opinion, but what are some of the things that might present that they could say, okay, I need a whole new route here?
Sure. I think that often, unfortunately, and so what I do with functional medicine and what functional medicine should be is optimizing the function of the body. So my short, boring answer would be everyone. We could all get into thrive mode versus being. And I think we all accept certain kind of dings of the body giving us feedback of imbalance as being quote unquote normal or as typical signs of aging, right? Or, varied things from literally low grade inflammation in your hands down to the level of insomnia and getting low quality sleep, down to the influence of having sticky malformed stool that I call cow pile stools when I'm talking to patients and accepting that as normal, right? There's so many different symptoms that we live with that we just accept. And these are ways of our body saying, hello, something isn't working.
Right.
But I do work with, for that reason, a lot of chronic illness. I work with a lot of autoimmune disease. So especially early onset of a diagnosis, or if you're I like to call my clients zebras often, meaning you don't fit the standard box of a diagnosis and your doctor keeps telling you everything's fine. And, they're running just your TSH for your thyroid assessment. So in functional medicine, we look really deep at the function of the body. And I like to break things down when I'm working with a patient on digestive, hormonal, structural, which is basically like their neuromuscular bone joint system, as well as their stress response, sleep, and energy cascades. And then, of course, I take in information on diet, consumption, and any other known medical history. But those are kind of the big areas that I dig deep into.
Awesome. I was hoping you would go there because I really do think the same thing that, most of us, and we hear it all the time from folks, like you said, that they just accept these abnormalities as normal. They accept
Sure.
joint pain and, allergies and skin absorptions and all these things as just a normal part of life, right?
Right. Like,
and
this is weird.
Yeah.
Move on.
It's so funny the way that you'll hear people talk about things as though it's absolutely separate of anything they could possibly do about it.
and then there's even the wellness realm. Like I work a lot of times with women that are dealing with hypothalamic amenorrhea or loss of their period. And so they went on birth control to regulate it.
Mm.
And it can take a year, to really work with their system to understand how to make hormone. Their body has to understand that it's safe and move out of reactive mode into regulatory mode. And there's a lot of pieces of that puzzle. And so something even like in an optimizing wellness, they might not have a symptom even, of other than just the void of lacking a cycle, but it's something that's really important. And we see just even infertility on the rise as a huge concern, and no one's asking why.
Absolutely. So I want to switch gears and talk about anxiety specifically, because obviously you've sort of thrown your hat in the ring on this particular subject, and you've written a book called The Anti-Anxiety Diet. And, I think that's such an interesting time that we're at right now. You're seeing anxiety and sort of, stress and depression and all of these things at an all-time high at the same time that you're seeing, metabolic disease at an all-time high.
Yes.
And so you're really obviously drawing the connection between those things. And you talk about the HPA axis being dysregulated. So maybe you can just first start off by explaining to our listeners, sort of what the HPA axis is and how you think this is influencing our moods.
Sure. That's a great entry point. So the HPA axis is our sympathetic nervous system fight or flight response in the body. And it stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. And so the hypothalamus and the pituitary are both in the brain. And then the adrenals are tiny stress responding glands that are probably the most popular of the three that sit above our kidneys. And when we are in reactive mode, or what we've maybe heard of as fight or flight mode, the HPA axis goes into overdrive, and both the hypothalamus and the pituitary shunt most of its energy towards stimulating the adrenal gland. And over chronic output from the adrenal gland, we can get missed messages of feedback where, for instance, in a healthy individual, or a balanced, I should say, individual, when they put out cortisol provides negative feedback. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary stop stimulating the adrenals to make cortisol. But when the hypothalamus and pituitary are stimulating the adrenals to make cortisol, they are lacking the stimulation of our thyroid release hormone is made by our hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus also primarily influences leptin response in the body, which is our satiety hormone. So regulation of being satisfied at mealtime and appetite regulation. Thyroid hormone regulation is huge with both the hypothalamus and pituitary. So our metabolism, our circadian rhythm can be thrown off. And then we can see in the pituitary a huge impact on sexual hormone. So both the thyroid and the ovaries or gonads, men or women or men, depending, is going to be greatly stimulated by that pituitary gland. So I call those regulatory functions, our metabolism, our reproductive health, our sleep cycles, and our satiety. And if we're in reactive fight or flight mode, the body doesn't know what's happening. The regulatory function tends to be imbalanced.
Mm-hmm. So the situation that somebody could experience with this, right? And if somebody's looking at this from sort of a symptomatic or an end result piece, they could see that they are hypothyroid and not necessarily draw that connection that the reason that they might be hypothyroid is in fact that they're stuck in essentially their sympathetic nervous system drive, which is
Right.
fundamentally prioritizing the adrenals over, production of thyroid or the production of sex hormones, right? Is that what you're?
Absolutely. And we
Yeah.
see more and more. I mean, I can't tell you the onset of in adolescence, a super high TSH, where we'll call it subclinical hypothyroidism because their free T3 and free T4 look fine. But the TSH is made by the pituitary, and the TSH just starts flipping out. Especially I have soccer player, high school dudes that are like also type A performers. Those guys are common where we'll see TSH going haywire because all that energy is going to the adrenals. And to connect that to stress response, not only do the adrenals make cortisol, which is a steroid hormone. So cortisol can have benefits and negatives. The benefit of cortisol is it can help to reduce histamine reactivity. So we're talking about like seasonal allergies and things like that. And it's anti-inflammatory by nature. That's what really, if we think of like a prednisone pack that someone might go on from an upper respiratory infection, or you might take a cortisone injection on a trigger point of an inflamed joint. So cortisol has beneficial anti-inflammatory support. And it's released in fight or flight mode because the body literally thinks it needs to survive. It thinks it's running from a cheetah. It doesn't understand that this is a mental stress. And that's where over time that anabolic hormone can drive belly fat, and it can drive imbalance in sleep cycles. And in the adrenal glands, we also make epinephrine, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And so epinephrine often surges as anxiety when it's not managed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got sort of an anchor point, if you will, on the HPA axis and sort of the function of that. So the next thing I want to walk the audience through is what would be some of the signs or symptoms that they could notice about themselves that would maybe lead them to consider whether or not this is an issue, if this is an HPA axis issue, or if this is normal stress. I think, again, like we talked about earlier, I think stress is one of those things that people have sort of accepted as a normal part of their life as well. And so I think it's a little bit more difficult to differentiate if it's to the point where, okay, now this is actually a medical issue and I need to look deeper. So maybe you can give us sort of a compass for that experience.
Sure. And I love that question because when I'm in clinic asking people through my stress assessment component of the session, everyone in their patient entry form says like moderate or low. And then I'm talking to them and I ask them questions like, do you clench your jaw? Oh, well, yeah, I wear a night guard. Okay.
Right.
Do you have muscular tension? Oh, every time I get a massage, my masseuse says, you're so tight. And I get these knots, and I've had frozen shoulder as a diagnosis. So I go to the chiropractor. Okay. And then I go forward, right? Do you deal with chronic constipation or loose stool? Oh, yeah. That's usually when we have excess peristalsis, or that vagus nerve responds in excess overdrive for loose stool, or it gets paralyzed when we're dealing with high stress as well. And that can be both symptoms on either end of the spectrum of imbalance. And then I mentioned sleep disturbances is a big one as well, right? So, I'm taking melatonin every night, but that's fine. And then I lost my period. I've gained belly fat, and I don't know where it's come from. No matter what macros I follow, I can't get rid of this belly fat. And then I think of chronic fatigue as well as irregular energy cascades. And so within that would be both like waking in the middle of the night, but also getting like random surges of energy. Like a lot of people get the wiry, like 10 p.m. Behavioral surge where they get really locked into their blue light. And that can also be an HPA axis symptom of imbalance.
Interesting. So everyone is stressed, basically.
I mean, well, we can all support it to be better, right? So I think that's the big thing for sure.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that's really starting to bubble up, certainly in our community, and it's people have been talking about it for quite a while, and you mentioned the blue light, and that's certainly part of it. But it's this sort of like always on thing that's going now, right? Where people have access to you, whether it's your boss or whether it's just your friends on Facebook, or all of these things that we sort of introduce into our lives as thumb stoppers on our phone. We're just scrolling through and looking at things and looking for this sort of next hit, and I really am I mean, it's really starting to show up that this is potentially problematic if not managed, right? And so I think some of these reasons or some of these things you're talking about may be kind of an outgrowth of that, where there just isn't any downtime anymore unless you really carve it out for yourself, right? I mean, you've got to, make a stand first, understand that it's a problem for you if it is, and then make a stand for how you're going to kind of roll some of that stuff back. Otherwise, they're your phone call or you're the next call in their day, right? I mean, they've got to get to this point of understanding that there's potentially an issue with it before they can kind of move forward.
Right. And I mean, I'm a huge proponent in anything. You can't, I use a lot of nutritional supplementation with clients as well as myself. And I often say, though, you can't over supplement lifestyle. You can work to bubble wrap, though, because you often need to. And there's certain external stressors that we're able to modify. And then there's certain ones that we aren't, like a terrible divorce or an abusive relationship or, and so I think it's important to both understand, yes, demand is insane now. The fact that literally within 3 decades, we used to, when we went on vacation, before email back in the day, before email, you actually got to go on a vacation. I don't know. I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm always working as well. But it's like, even if you put on a vacation responder, you're still supposed to be accountable in most situations of professional performance to constantly be on. I mean, it's insane. Right. And we expect return within that same light speed return. I mean, think back, 6 decades when we were snail mailing communication. I want to go back there and think of when you could screen your calls by just not answering and people weren't like, I texted you. Right?
Yeah, I saw this Instagram post the other day that was pretty funny. It was like, we worked so hard to go from, the Pony Express to being able to talk on the phone. And now we've just gone back to writing really fast letters to each other.
Instant telegraph.
Yeah, exactly. So, totally. Okay. I want to get back to some of the diagnostics that you use. And you talked about the intake document that you have to sort of help people self-diagnose where they're at stress-wise. What are some of the other tools that you like to use to get a comprehensive workup of what's really happening with them physically?
Yeah. So even within this concept of HPA axis imbalance, I use a different 6-point entry influence of functional assessments. And so the one that you would commonly think of as assessing the HPA axis would likely be my end point, which is a salivary collection of cortisol. I also look at DHEA, which is super important with especially performance and people that are doing a keto diet. And I look at sexual hormone often at the same time because we're in there, might as well look at those values as well. And I look at urinary metabolites of neurotransmitters. But with that said, I start my kind of anti-anxiety diet uses this 6R approach. So the first R is actually to reduce inflammation. And this is because when the body is actually producing inflammatory chemicals, those chemicals can cross the blood-brain barrier and they interfere with the way that our neurotransmitters perform. So for me, I'm saying, why look down? And also inflammation drives cortisol. So it's like, why start there? I would start with inflammation. And so I kind of follow this line where it's removing inflammatory foods. Then we look at resetting the microbiome and look at the building blocks, the powerhouse that manufactures our neurotransmitters. So we know serotonin and GABA, 2 of our main mellower outer neurotransmitters, are manufactured by our probacteria. And we know that on the other end of the spectrum, dysbiotic bacteria make epinephrine. How crazy is that? So it's like literally your gut drives your neurotransmitters, and then we move from inflammation and gut biome into repairing gut lining, into restoring micronutrients. So there's, mood stabilizing minerals, there's B vitamins that play a factor as activators or cofactors for our neurotransmitters, and then amino acids that are building blocks to make neurotransmitters. And then I end with adrenals and neurotransmitters. And that's the first lab I talked about, the saliva and the urinary metabolites.
Right. And so that's, so for the urinary metabolites, you're talking something like a Dutch test or something like that, right?
Well,
Where they're looking.
I do use Dutch, but I actually use Labrix for neurotransmitter metabolites. And this looks at actually serotonin, GABA, norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, and glutamate.
Right. And so, but it's looking at the metabolites, which fundamentally are the end product, right? So what you're, so what you're gathering from that versus a serum level, so to speak, is that you can see how the body's using it or not using it, right? Is
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And that's something that I think, we've had Carrie Jones on, and we've gone through some of this stuff. And it's something that I just can't drive home to our folks enough, is that we have to look at what's there and what your body's using. I mean, anytime we're doing this, the technology is just getting so good, and we have such a great way of looking at what all is going on that, if you're, it was my PSA for the day, if your doctor is saying your serum levels are good and they're not well and nothing is resolved, and man, you got to look at door number 2 and see what's going on. So anyway,
especially with steroids, so I mean, all hormones, estradiol or E2 and estriol and testosterone, DHEA, cortisol, all steroids are just terrible to assess in serum. So salivary or urinary metabolites are definitely the way to go.
Amazing. So, gosh, this is so informative, and it's great because, we see depression, anxiety, we see all of this stuff just rampant in all communities, whether it's just our programs, our online programs, or if it's, actually in our personal life, we just see that so many people are suffering from this. And I want to talk about the ketogenic diet, because you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I know that you're using it pretty therapeutically for a lot of these cases. So let's talk about what kind of person is what it's appropriate for. Is that something that you want people to do long term, or is it just a therapeutic dose in order to kind of get them back into a more traditional, albeit maybe more low carb diet, but are you trying to get people to maybe have a maintenance of ketogenic eating as well?
It's a loaded question. I'm happy to answer it. I love talking things keto. So I've been using the ketogenic diet clinically for 10 years. And my book uses ketosis as the first phase of the diet program. Mm-hmm. And the reason I did this is that the same mechanism in which ketones, when the liver produces ketones in absence of carbohydrates, right? Ketones can actually cross the blood-brain barrier. So, I mentioned that both inflammatory chemicals can cross the blood-brain barrier, as can ketones. Neurotransmitters can't. And so that's an interesting thing to kind of consider there. But our ketones, when they cross the blood-brain barrier, have the ability to upregulate GABA expression. And I mentioned GABA is one of the most mellower outer compounds. I think it's an unsung hero of our neurotransmitters, truly. And we burn through GABA under stress. And if you think of Parkinson's disease, GABA is the one that we see very physiologically influenced, where we're dealing with tremors and tension. And when I'm distinguishing from an individual low serotonin or GABA, GABA tends to be more physiological, like the white knuckle effect from stress, or the impulse control issues, or the tension in the system, shortness of breath, performance anxiety. So GABA helps to ketones upregulate GABA expression. So you get this awesome mellow. And then ketones also reduce oxidative stress. They reduce inflammation, and they can help to reduce that excessive epinephrine in the body. So there are actual clinical neurotransmitter influences of making a therapeutic level of ketones in the bloodstream. So there's a benefit to that. And I, though, with that being said, have a really unique approach to ketosis. And so I'm probably one of the only ones out there that is vehemently against non-caloric sweeteners. So no recipes in any of my books or any of my anything out there will have erythritol, stevia, monk fruit, you name it. Mm-hmm. Because I really believe in channeling savory and redefining your relationship with food, in the sense that we appreciate the natural sweetness of a Marcona almond or of an avocado. And so as you reshift that palate and you're doing a whole food keto approach, and you become fat adapted, often you can use moderate amounts of carbs. In fact, I had an Instagram post yesterday that was fun, getting comments on, and I said top 5 keto sweeteners, and I included banana, dates, honey, robust maple syrup, and people are like, "What?" And I was like, I didn't say top keto snacks. I said top keto sweeteners. And I have an awesome recipe for low carb zucchini collagen muffins that use a banana in the entire recipe of 12. And it has less than 3 total grams of carbs, not even net, 3 total. So, it's a different kind of, so yes, I'm not on a pedestal as a vehement fighter against carb foods, but I believe that we should work as kind of a hybrid machine. I think that the human is optimizing its performance to make therapeutic ketones. And I think that each individual has a different metabolic threshold. And then I'll take a breath, but then I have a where low carb can get bad. Cause I know that that's something you asked too, is like, is it a thing?
Like where can you kind of go off the rails with it? But I would just want to touch real quick on therapeutic blood ketone levels, because I know in the keto world, this is something that goes around and around. And I know we've certainly seen with our own clients and in our own community where people will really go down the rabbit hole with blood ketone testing.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to hit some magic number that's therapeutic that may just not be possible for them, because they just have never been able to do it. And so maybe you could just dive into that a little bit and what you would consider a therapeutic level in the blood, and then also how you would go about understanding that or measuring it.
Sure. So, and even that, when we're talking about diagnostics, there's controversy, hence like the big upspring of level and different breath meters of is blood showing us what we're using or what we're spilling. We definitely know urinary metabolites in the form of ketones are, and it's a solute and not the best measurement. But generally speaking, if we're talking about blood and not going down that rabbit hole, somewhere between 0.8 upwards of, I don't like to go above in women, especially 2.5. So a lot of people love to go for like 4s and whatnot. And I generally see that as a sign of imbalance. Like, why is your body overproducing?
Right.
So I think there's a sweet spot, like even we could say 0.5 to 2.5 or 3. And when it starts getting higher, I get concerned. And the only population that I use exogenous ketones with, or BHB, is my epileptic and neurological pediatric population, where they're really relying on that. And then we're talking about a different world of therapeutics.
Sure.
But that's not what we're generally speaking.
Right. Well,
thanks.
But thanks for bringing it up though, because this is something that we hear all the time, sort of in the common vernacular, and even from some people who you would expect something different, is that, well, this is great for epileptics and this is the number that works for them. So this is why wouldn't you shoot for this? And you're like, well, boy, that's, you're carving a big swath there, when you've got somebody who's, using ketosis as a tool for something other than, cancer or epilepsy. It's a very different world, So I'm glad that you parsed that out a little.
And I think the same thing is a misnomer with protein restriction and so many other things. But I want to make sure I note on the question of when low carb could go bad, because what I see in women, and we're speaking about hypothalamic imbalance, right? Or we're talking about this HPA axis connection. So yes, ketones can be very therapeutic. They can put us into a regulatory mode. They can upregulate leptin, which is favorable for our hypothalamus, very grounding. And that's like what people call the keto high. That I believe is the leptin reaction for sure. It's like when I feel like I'm walking through a parking lot and I could just pick up a stranger and hug them for no reason.
Right.
That's like a keto high, right? And that mental clarity and all of those things. What happens often, I think, is this trifecta, and it might be more than 3 things, so I need a new word, but of over-caffeinating, over-calorie restricting, under-sleeping, and then doing too much intermittent fasting for someone that doesn't have ample body fat reserve. That woman who you guys probably deal with as a lot of clients, right? That person who wants to do the best, hottest diet trend, that's doing it type A with their highlighter and whatever.
Right.
That person needs to consider a strategic carb cycling, because likely they're going to go from that leptin resistance, which most people eating a standard diet have, to leptin optimized function to leptin depletion. And when leptin levels drop, that puts a parasympathetic shutdown and turns that sympathetic, it works against you, right? And that's where then women lose their cycle. So there's a lot of, logic and theory, and that's where some people can make therapeutic ketones eating 50 to 60 grams of carbs, and that's totally legit, and I don't see anything wrong with that.
Yeah. And that's something I think, because keto is just such a thing, and we've been in this for a while, and it's like the first time keto kind of came around, there was a lot more sort of, hey, this is probably a decent tool thing. And it seems like this most recent resurgence in the last, I don't know, probably 2 years, I guess 18 months, 2 years is where it's really started to bubble up. I feel like has lost some of the nuance. And that's why I was happy to see the Keto Gains guys, who I'm sure you're familiar with to some degree, pop up and start saying, hey, here's a way to do this, albeit coming from a strength athlete and bodybuilder perspective. But look, we're doing this on, 0.8 grams of protein. And that guy over there ate 100 grams of carbohydrate today, but he's still in this zone. So let's really look at the nuance of what it is that you're trying to do and who you are as a person, what you do, what your goals are, before we start just sort of throwing out something that says, hey, that's way too much protein. And, you can't even have 2 pieces of broccoli. That's like over the top for the day,
If you're stressing about celery, that's not going to play well. Louie and I were on a panel at PaleoFX, and we have very similar mindsets on that. And absolutely, I think it can be a great tool to balance women's hormones, and it can be a tool to jack women's hormones if you're doing it inappropriately. And it all comes down to one of my favorite mantras I use everywhere is doctrine creates disconnect. So it's like, if you become doctrinated with the vegan diet, if you become doctrinated with the keto diet, any diet, right? Anything, and it becomes your religion, and you start silencing the hair loss you're experiencing, you start silencing the lack of sleep, right? All of these symptoms we've been talking about today, then that means you got to you got to switch something up, right? You got to pull something out or add something and recalibrate and start listening to that feedback.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's it. Drop the mic.
Hallelujah. Yeah. Speaking of religion. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is so important because, again, I think that we're so overwhelmed as a society in terms of all the responsibility, all the things that are on our plate. We just want someone to tell us what to do.
Yes.
Just give me please just tell me, what do I eat? Okay, it's keto. I can do it. I'm good. Like I'll do whatever it is, but they just don't want to think about it anymore because it is overwhelming. And obviously as a practitioner, like you spend your whole life understanding it. It's really an overwhelming thing for somebody to decipher for themselves. And so I can really understand why people end up that place. But I think it's so important, like you said, that, you have to stay connected to the experience your body's actually having.
Absolutely. And your body's dynamic. What works for you in the spring of 2018 may be completely different in the winter of 2019 and in the spring of 2019, and you name it, because we're constantly under different environmental demands, and not just actually our living environment, but our stress demands. All of these things are going to make an influence of how we utilize nutrients, how we metabolize nutrients. And then there's the hormonal factor that's constantly evolving in relationship to our fats, carbs, and protein. And so I think it's definitely something that there's no end all be all. And I think it's not sexy to say that because, like you said, everyone wants a plan.
Yes.
But I had a hard time with my publishers going back with this. And I still wanted to educate people about the keto thing, but I tried to really clearly in my book lay out that principle that I have a phase 1 and a phase 2, and you might be a phase 1.5, and that's cool. That works for you at this moment,
Yeah. So there's something I want to kind of jump into here because we've brought it up a couple times, and that's there's potentially some incongruencies between people who are on keto and people who are super stressed out. And then there's this piece that's people that aren't really sleeping all that well. And so I'm probably going to bumble through this a little bit, but so something that we've certainly seen in our own situation, and I guess I'll just talk about my personal experience with it. So when keto, gosh, so probably
I know a friend.
Yeah,
I'm asking for a friend. Yeah.
So like 2007, 8, something like that. I was like the quintessential hardcore paleo, hardcore CrossFit, working full time with the fire department, sleeping, 4 hours a night, cumulatively, plus all the stress
Doing
and
all the
of
right
that kind of
things.
stuff. Yeah, exactly. Doing everything right. Just kind of nailing it. And then dove into the keto thing because I was like, all right, well, look, this is something that's going on. I know just internally that the sleep regulation and the lack of sleep is starting to affect the way that I am operating. I'm waking up type 2 diabetic is kind of what it feels like, and if you in testing blood sugar and all this kind of stuff. So I dove down this rabbit hole with keto and gave it a good college try, probably 2 solid years of being fairly strict with keto and trying to manage that while sort of modulating my strength training a little bit. But without the sleep piece, and this is my supposition, is that without the sleep piece being managed, it just wasn't really feasible for me to get the therapeutic benefit, of keto. Now, granted, there was probably a lot of very positive things that were happening just because of the shift in my diet and more whole foods and all of that. But without that sleep piece, it just wasn't possible for me to nail it for myself. And so I'm curious, if you have somebody that's coming in, and let's say they come in with this, with the anxiety piece, right? Let's just say they like read your book and they're like, okay, this is me. The book was amazing, but I can't seem to sort this out for myself. Like, how do I approach this? And in your intake, you find that they are insomniacs for one reason or the other. They're, let's say they're getting accumulation of 4 hours of sleep a night, and that's just kind of what they deem to be normal. How do you address that? I mean, given that, we're saying that the ketogenic diet is super helpful for all the reasons that you said to, stimulating GABA and doing all of these things that would fundamentally help with the sleep. Which one of those do you address first, or do you have a magic concoction that handles both?
So there can be varied reasons of why you wouldn't get, good outcomes with keto, or why keto may not fit in this present time. And like I said, one of them is if you're depleted in leptin. And so you can actually look at and monitor and measure leptin levels. And someone that is very fit, doesn't have a lot of, as I mentioned, body fat, tends to have less leptin. And so that's something to consider. And so you could optimize them first by ensuring that they're getting a good EFA supplement, and probably run that for like a good 90 days before going into a tight carb restriction to help to ramp up their leptin. You could also consider DHEA, which I kind of very briefly mentioned. And so for someone that's under chronic stress, often we'll see depletion over time. We tend to go from stressed and wired to stressed and tired. And although insomnia sounds like stressed and wired, often insomnia can come at the stressed and tired time, because the cortisol cascade gets very wonky in this like end stage of adrenal insufficiency. And within that time of cortisol getting thrown off, we can also see DHEA depletion. And so DHEA is a precursor to testosterone and estrogen, but it also plays a big role as a metabolite in ketone production. So just lowering carbs doesn't necessitate that the body's going to be successful at making ketones. And those are two kind of hormonal things to consider, leptin and DHEA. And then if the individual comes to me and they're not sleeping, some things I would look at to take it further would be nutrient status. So if you came from a really clean paleo diet, you didn't have any digestive disturbances, I probably wouldn't be concerned about that individual versus like the high-powered attorney who is taking spin class every morning and, eating crap, truly, but still lean, the same model that you mentioned, but not eating really clean. Then I would probably focus more on nutrient repletion first, because things like carnitine, for instance, carnitine drives fat shuttle metabolism. And so if you're carnitine depleted, you're not going to have success with ketosis. So I think there's so many different things, but sleep is an absolute need for so many of the neurological and neurotransmitter influences, as well as immunological and inflammatory. And then there's definitely metabolic. Our adiponectin and leptin are definitely influenced by sleep. So I'm not opposed to melatonin. I think melatonin can be a great tool. But melatonin is made from serotonin. So I always think down to kind of the biome. And then I think of the B vitamins that play a role in that activation, and really working from the root, kind of working with that level of microbiome support and B vitamins are things to definitely consider.
Yeah, so it's this situation where you're like, okay, so maybe you're a little low on melatonin, but maybe the reason that you're a little low on melatonin is because you're actually low on serotonin, and the reason you're low on serotonin is because your gut's not doing what it's supposed to.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. What a tangle!
I know, right? My answers are always like this. They're rough. And then the other thing to consider is like phosphatidylserine and cortisol. So, if someone's in a V, if we look at their cortisol and instead of an L, which they're supposed to rise with the birds and then slowly cascade, if someone's in a V, you can't always chase with melatonin. Sometimes they need phosphatidylserine, which is amino acid derived compound that is going to block that cortisol peak. Right. But again, then before that, do you work with parasympathetic breath and meditation to try to get the body to mellow out? So there's always a root, always a deeper layer.
Yeah, but I love these answers though, because it's
real.
It's real. I mean, this is what it is. And it's one of the things that I think is, and going back to what Vanessa mentioned earlier, that people just want an answer, and they're often frustrated when you can't just give them an answer. And it's like, look, man, there's, if somebody's going to give you just an answer, it may not work for you. There's got to be a little more to it.
Well, and obviously coming from your background, it's like you're very well immersed in this stuff, and you have to give all of these answers because there's so many different pieces of this puzzle. And I think people who are just giving a one-line answer, they don't know as much as you.
That's what I say too. I'm like, watch out with anything, right? Everyone loves algorithms, and everyone loves a 1 + 2 = 3 equation. And things like leaky gut and even the concept of adrenal fatigue, they're getting very sexy now, but you have to watch out just as much of getting into kind of that turnstile of a functional, with air quotes, practitioner or naturopath that puts everyone. I can't tell you how many people I deal with that are like, oh, well, I'm on a leaky gut protocol. And I'm like, why? I look at their labs. I'm like, well, your secretary IgA is beautiful. Like why?
Right.
And my doctor said I have
sexy thing to do now.
Because I went on. What protocol do you want today? So I think it's important. And I tried to with my book for people that want to weed things out. Every one of those entry points, so reducing inflammation, repairing the gut, to resetting the microbiome, I put a quiz at the end of every chapter. So you could kind of at least get into my mind space and hopefully then determine what is your Achilles heel of those 6 R's, because not everyone needs to follow that pathway of the inflammation, blah, 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 to the adrenals. Some people might start in one entry point or another. And I tried to empower the reader to really connect with their body and see where their highest need, so that then they can delve into that section of, I have lab support per R as well as supplement support per R, and then food as medicine recipes for each focus. So you can really like hone in on and nourish and coat the body.
Love it. This is amazing. What an awesome resource for people, and such a timely resource.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And by the way, monk fruit and stevia and all that shit tastes terrible anyway. Get off it, people.
So bad. Yeah.
I know.
Disgusting.
It's like, I can't tell you how many times at a conference someone like hands me something, and I just like, I'm like actually very socially awkward, and I'm actually a total introvert. But like, so when someone gives me something, sometimes I just like do the courtesy bite, and then I like I can't filter the face, and I make this weird like tongue scorched up nose, and it's bad.
Well, I've sort of had this thing in the back of my mind forever about artificial sweeteners, and it's like, it just doesn't seem like a good idea. And I've people are like, well, can I use stevia for this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Somebody who's trying to, in another sort of just broad term in this world. Well, I want to become fat adapted, so I'm doing this. But my God, my coffee tastes terrible with this butter in it, so I put stevia in here.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know if the stevia is the problem, but it just seems like such a bad idea. And I think there was a paper somewhere that I read about the body having some difficulty not knowing what to do down the road. So when it tastes something sweet in the mouth, but then the calories from something that should be sweet don't actually show up, it creates this disconnect. Yeah.
Ding dong ditch effect. But no, there are GLP taste receptors, and that plays glucagon like peptidide. It's called GLP-1, and so it mimics like a blood sugar drop. And we can definitely get cephalic insulin response. It's like the Pavlov's dog. You ring the bell, you get food. You ring the bell, you get food. You taste sweet. The body, and in different people's metabolism respond differently, but some people get severe hypoglycemic dips in blood sugar when they eat these non-caloric sweeteners because of that insulin response. And the whole benefit, like we said, so one of the benefits alone of keto or low carb is dropping your insulin levels. So we wouldn't want to drive something that stimulates insulin release. And at the end of the day, I think that if you eat them, you're constantly, every time you go, my thing I always say to clients is like, every time you go to Starbucks or a wedding, you're always going to crave that muffin, that cake, that you're never going to redefine your palate because you've been telling yourself that sweet's okay. It's like breaking up with one abusive boyfriend and then just like naming Tom Jim and being like, okay, well, Jim's cool though, because,
because he's not Tom.
Yeah, you're going to go back to Tom. At some point, you're going to binge back to Tom, man. And so you just got to reset.
Yeah.
Go for Steve.
Go for Steve.
Go for Steve, yeah.
Steve's salty. And
yeah, exactly. Awesome. Savory Steve's got it going on.
Awesome. This has been so informative, and we'd love to let the listeners know where they can learn more about you and where they can find the book.
Sure. Awesome. So everything, we keep it really simple. It's Ali Miller RD. So it's ALIMILLER RD, like at Ali Miller RD on Instagram and Facebook and all of the places. And then the website is alimillerrd.com. And on there, I have books and programs and all of the things.
Yeah, that's cool. And I think I noticed that you sling some of your books on all the normal places, but you can also buy it on IndieBound, which I think is cool.
Yeah.
IndieBound IndieBound's a cool company that's just kind of trying to, shake this whole thing up a little bit. So it's awesome. Props.
We like disruptors.
Thank you. Yeah. Go rogue.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome, Ali. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And I know our audience will get a lot out of this conversation. We certainly did. And we really look forward to seeing what's next for you. I'm sure there's going to be more in the pipeline that keeps us all informed and inspired.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. It's my pleasure. And it was a great time.
Awesome.
Right. That's a wrap, folks. I hope you guys enjoyed that podcast. We certainly enjoyed recording it.
We did.
We did.
We enjoyed Ali tremendously, and we are going to have her back.
100%. So keep your eyes out for a questionnaire. We'll be looking for some questions. We'll go through, hand select them, send them to her, and we can dive deep on some cool stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, if you guys want to see more of our adventures, we'll be down in Costa Rica this week at Rhythmia Retreat Center with some lucky bees and doing some special internal work, let's say.
Indeed.
And so if you want to keep up on that, you can follow us at Be The Wellness on Instagram. And don't forget, folks, if you're liking the podcast, leave us a 5-star review. Write a nice comment.
Yes.
All of those things. Put a lot of emojis.
Can you put emojis in
I actually
reviews?
Don't know. I'm not sure. But if you can, put them all.
Yeah, good ones. None
High
of those
fives,
little turd piles.
Fist bumps. No turd piles.
Yeah, boy.
All right, guys. Folks. This is clearly over. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
And